Okay. Thank you, Deputy Pringle, for your contribution. Now, Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, I certainly won't repeat the points made by other deputies. I note you got a little bit restless during the comments of my colleague, Deputy Pringle. Hardly unsurprising, given that he has spent the majority of his working life working with water and certainly knows what he's talking about in terms of conservation. So I thought it was interesting that you seem to get upset by those points. I think what we have in front of us here really, with the proposition in this legislation and the idea of a commission, really is a fudge, or a sort of a sleight of hand, where ye hope that by putting this in place and leaving it there for a while, that you might get to a situation where the almighty anger that had rocked the streets in every county would somehow dissipate, that people would forget about it and kind of settle for some middle ground or some other solution other than the outright abolition of water charges and indeed the enshrining of the idea of water as a public utility. And that is just not going to happen. Consistently throughout the past period, the government and the political establishment has underestimated the level of opposition on this issue. And when we talk about a mechanism to decide how our water supply can be funded into the future, the only basis of doing that, and your starting point, if you were genuine about that, is to say that the people have spoken, have very clearly spoken, and said they are not interested in a direct charge for water, that the idea of paying for public services through progressive taxation, water being one of them, is a model that's worked well and one that they want to continue. So suspending the charge in some ways really is, it would be far simpler if you just abolished it outright, because kicking it down the road, I'm sorry, is not going to pawn people off or quieten the opposition, because at the end of the day, water is essential for life. We're an island nation. Walk out the door now, you'll be absolutely saturated. Of course, water that falls from the sky is not the same as purified drinking water. It does cost money, but there are many things we could be doing to enhance and collect that rainwater and improve our supply. And we certainly don't need an Irish Water or a privatised model in order to deliver that situation. And I think you're miscalculating seriously, because once the charges are suspended, it's going to be very hard to restart that engine. Now, obviously, loads of people haven't paid already, myself included. I've no intention of paying for the next 9 months, or indeed any months that come after this situation either. And I'm quite satisfied that I am with a substantial majority of the population in that regard, and that even includes some of the ones who were bullied into paying. And I think you're miscalculating again the huge opposition that was harnessed by the Right to Water movement because of all of the other austerity cuts that were going through and people experienced. And I think the points that deputies have made highlighting the dangers of privatisation are critical to this discussion, and I just want to maybe make a few points about that, because people in this internet age know what goes on in other countries, and what happened in Detroit, for example, where other families who were already in financial difficulties became the victims of water shut-offs, denied access to a water supply. A city where 23,000 homes were cut off from water in 2015, while the flow of water wasn't cut off to businesses who owed twice as much as domestic residents, gives a sort of perspective of what privatisation means if private companies are allowed to come in here. Big companies, big business in Detroit were able to negotiate on their bills, have big portions written off, but no such facility offered to hard-pressed families. And that's the future scenario. And that's one of the key reasons why people took to the streets. It was the honourable position to, I suppose, defend everybody's water supply. So therefore, if we're looking at a commission here and we're saying that we're open to anything, that you're not in any way interested in privatisation or anything like that, why in God's name are you continuing with a water metering programme? doesn't make any sense whatsoever unless it's linked to a plan of privatisation. Everybody knows that individual water meters are not a conservation measure at all. The economies of scale don't add up to that point. A complete and utter waste of money. Now, district water metering has been incredibly successful in detecting leakage and so on, but once you get to an individual household basis, that argument carries less weight. So why would you bother to spend all those hundreds of millions doing that unless you wanted to isolate the individual supply, introduce a payment structure which would allow that service to eventually be privatised and profited from? Because it is about identifying a funding stream, not for fixing the pipes, but for providing dividends for future shareholders, be they Veolia, Nestle, Thames Water, whoever it is. The loser at the end of the day would be Irish families. And that's why anything other than a continuation of funding our water supply through progressive taxation is not going to wash with citizens at the end of your commission process. And, you know, I think there is a double speak in what you're doing. And the fact that metering is continuing and the criminalisation of protest is continuing exposes, if you like, the sham that has gone on. I thought it was a little bit ironic the other night. I was going to say watching the football, but sadly I wasn't watching it because I was in here when Robbie Brady scored the winning goal for Ireland. A young man who, as a result of that, has been sort of elevated to hero status, really, in the country. Well, Robbie's mother, Maya Brady, is one of the water warriors in the community of Edenmore in North Dublin. And she, to me, is a hero. Like many of her colleagues, men and women, in many instances who've raised their families in working class communities around Dublin and around the country, people who have given up their time to protect a water supply for their children and their grandchildren. And I think there is an irony in this. We salute working class people's sports achievements, but we wreak havoc in the communities that they live in, and we don't recognise it then. I've no doubt that when these young fellas were young, playing football on the streets of their communities, they were probably labelled as gurriers or whatever, and now they're translated into heroes. But these are the communities that you've been trying to criminalise by the unholy alliance between An Garda Síochána, Irish Water and the henchmen and collaborators in Farran's. And it really just isn't good enough. And it's brought this country to a completely different place, I suppose, than it has been previously. And it has substantially undermine the credibility of An Garda Síochána, which many senior officers would have said to us has been very regrettable for them. Communities where they've spent years trying to build up a proper relationship, where they've tried to get decent Garda resources into their communities, couldn't do it for normal policing work, but yet over time no object when there's a water protest or anywhere to be seen. Now there's too many of these instances to mention, but I do think they're relevant in the context of the metering programme continuing. There was the morning when Irish Water lined up with dozens of trucks blocking traffic on the Oscar Traynor Road with a Garda escort in Coolock, completely disrespecting the people of that community. Very, very heavy-handed tactics, which resulted in 200 women having a silent protest outside the Garda station in that area and giving birth to the Pink Ladies, as they became later on. There was the day when Farran's workers arrived in Stoneybatter with their balaclavas on. The disgraceful imprisonment of 2 Wicklow pensioners in the last month. 66-year-old Sean Doyle, who suffers from Parkinson's disease. 60-year-old Eamon McGrath. 2 gentlemen who had an excellent relationship with the local Gardaí, peacefully protesting in the depot in Wicklow. At the same time, on that day, an assault was carried out on one of the protesters, and the guards did absolutely nothing about that situation. And this is in an era where everything is supposed to be frozen, where we're looking at how we might deal with our water supply into the future. But water metering is being unleashed in communities all over the city. In my own constituency, again, in the last 2 weeks, a woman, a public servant, was arrested and handcuffed when she was standing on a balcony some way away from a protest that wasn't actually obstructing anybody. Another woman in my area, a woman in poor health, was in the shower one morning, relatively recently, when 5 guards broke down her front door with a warrant for a red jacket. This woman lives on her own. She's in poor health. They were looking for a red jacket. Now, I don't think the Kinahans get treated like that, and it's just absolutely reprehensible. And it's about intimidating ordinary working class communities, people who are involved in legitimate protest. Protest is not a crime. Protest is actually a very important part of any democratic society, and I think it's absolutely reprehensible, because why are these people doing it? Why do people who've never been involved in any activity before decide to go and protest to stop meters being imposed in their community? Because they see that the only logic in doing that is to ultimately privatise that service. And they don't believe that when you stand up in here and say, don't be worrying about that, lads, we've no intention of privatising it, it'll be grand, sure, don't worry. They don't believe you, because on the ground you're putting in place an infrastructure to precisely facilitate that situation. And that's why, as Deputy Pringle said, it's absolutely critical that we move that legislation to protect our water supply. It's been a worldwide failure. 180 cities and communities in 35 countries have all remunicipalised their water in the past decade. The failure of privatisation actually is accelerating. In the last 5 years, the failure rate of water and sewerage privatisations has increased to 34%, compared to with a failure rate of just 6% for energy, 3% for telecommunications, and 7% for transportation during the last period. There is a litany of problems with privatisation, from lack of infrastructure investments to tariff hikes to environmental hazards and so on. And the reality is that actually it's the public sector and the public model that is much better placed to provide access to water, to avoid water poverty, to protect the quality of water, and to protect citizens' human right to water. And that's not anticipating the Commission's outcome before it's met. It's based on worldwide experience of what's gone on in other jurisdictions, and indeed on what has gone on here, because the lack of infrastructural investment in water here was as a result of, not because we didn't have an Irish water, or not because we didn't have enough money, but because he chose not to do so. And instead, for example, in the last number of budgets, decided to write off hundreds of millions to the wealthiest sections in society, amounts which, had they been collected, would generate far more money for investment in water and indeed other public services than anything else that ye have done previously. So funding this public service, like others, should be done through progressive central taxation, and it is by far and away the best model. So while I'm quite happy that you're suspending the charges for 9 months, I think it's a fudge. I think we're going to be, in 9 months' time, or if it's 12 by the time, in exactly the position that we're in now, and you'd really want to face up to it. This issue is not going to go away. In actual fact, people will take some comfort or solace out of the fact that you had to suspend it, and will probably, that'll even redouble their intention not to pay. But I think the damage that you'll do by continuing down this road is absolutely immense. Not just in terms of the investment of our supply, but also, as I say, the damage that's been done in communities all over the country through your attempts to criminalise legitimate protests in order to facilitate a process where a public service may potentially and likely be privatised into the future. And this is going to cause you huge problems, because not only that, there is evidence emerging in the courts in a number of these cases which are being taken of very high-level collusion between the DPP's office, between An Garda Síochána, between Irish Water and their contractors in terms of trying to criminalise people even before any protests took place, even before any charges were put on people. Some of these meetings and anticipations were taking place in order to block and demonise people. And I think it's very sinister that we have legislation, including Section 12 of the Water Act, where subcontractors or workers in Irish Water can basically decide whether somebody is intending to do something or blocking them. It's giving, if you like, subcontractors nearly the powers akin to An Garda Síochána. And it's even providing a situation where their people can be found guilty potentially of an offence, even if they didn't know that they were causing that offence or not. If somebody's car broke down in front of, say, a water meter installation truck or whatever, they could then be prosecuted on the basis of the evidence of a subcontractor to say that they had intended to commit a criminal act. Now, that's unlawful. As far as I'm concerned, it's actually probably unconstitutional as well. But yet, a huge amount of legal power has been transferred to Irish Water and to Farrens, the subcontractors, who are not actually officers of the law. It's a very, very dangerous precedent, and to my mind, it's a conflict of interest that the DPP's office at the highest levels would be liaising on these matters in advance of any prosecution and indeed in the advance of any charge actually being put out on any citizen. I think Garda discretion has been usurped again in this issue by senior officers, and in many instances it has cut across decent policing. Again, every Section 12 prosecution that's been taken to the courts at the moment has been tried or is being tried as a summary matter, and again, but up to being brought to court, the offence is an indictable version. Huge legal problems coming down the track for you in this regard, Minister, and I really think that the best approach would be to adhere to the mandate of the public, which was to say people have spoken with their feet. They're not interested in direct charges for water. They want the service funded through central taxation, and they want it enshrined as a public utility. Pretty straightforward, and I think in some ways this whole exercise is just a waste of time, and we'll be here in a year's time to come.
Thank you.